We've previously touched on the idea that while state capacity isn't necessarily the stronger, the better, a robust state capacity is of vital importance. Many nations grapple with persistent conflict, subpar public services, and economic stagnation due to weak state capacity. An obvious question arises: where does state capacity originate from? Why are some countries endowed with formidable state capacity while others are left feeble? In the following lectures, I intend to delve into this question. Today, I wish to discuss a factor that might surprise you. War. The mention of war often elicits an instinctive aversion. Undoubtedly, war has inflicted profound disasters on humanity, with a record that is difficult to fully document. However, an ironic historical fact is that on many levels, war is also the mother of modern civilization. It has accelerated technological advancements from the progress in iron casting to the development of nuclear energy, computers, and ultrasound technologies, all of which are intricately linked to warfare. War is also the mother of modern finance theories. Fighting requires funding, and with limited royal revenues, financial innovations became necessary, leading to the creation of bonds, bills of exchange, mortgage loans, and central bank. Furthermore, war has even given birth to modern democracy. Why again? Because warfare demands funding. When kings sought money and the nobility was reluctant to provide it, a stalemate ensued, eventually leading the nobility to concede on the condition that a parliament be established to deliberate on such matters. This marked the initial origin of representative democracy. Thus, war has spurred scientific progress, shaped modern finance, and fostered representative democracy. Relevant to our topic today, war also creates state. War drives political centralization. What does it mean to say that war creates states? Simply put, it means that in the process of natural selection, where the fittest survive and the weak are eliminated, war strengthens the state capacity of those nations that endure. This viewpoint is not my own discovery, but rather the perspective of a group of scholars. The renowned scholar Charles Tilly once said, "Wars made states, and states made war." Although Tilly's primary focus was on European nations, his analysis holds reference value for other regions as well. Why do we say war creates states? This viewpoint stems from a transition puzzle. Western European countries experienced a transformation in their political forms around the 1500 to 1800 period. What kind of transformation? It was a widespread shift from a feudal system to a centralized system. As you may know, there was a similar political transition in Chinese history, known as the Zhou-Qian transition, the feudal Western Zhou dynasty, after the evolution through the spring and autumn and warring states periods, gradually transformed into the centralized Qian dynasty. However, in China, this event occurred over 2,000 years ago, while Europe's Zhou-Qian transition happened 1,000 or 2,000 years later, and the depth of the transition was much less than that in China. It can be said that the political form change in Western Europe around 1500 to 1800 was a late occurring, weaker version of the Zhou-Qian transition. The most significant change from a feudal system to a centralized system is, metaphorically speaking, the shift from a honeycomb structure to a pyramid structure. Under the feudal system, the notion that a lord's lord is not a lord meant that the entire kingdom was structured like a series of honeycombs. Kings could command nobles, but not directly rule over the common people. However, under the centralized system, indirect rule transformed into direct rule. The king broke through the noble class and directly conscripted and taxed citizens, and naturally provided public services. The barriers of the honeycomb structure were dissolved, and the entire nation merged into a cohesive pyramid. Of course, there were some bureaucrats between the king and the citizens, but these bureaucrats were appointed by the king and served as his representatives, unlike the nobles, who became nobles because their fathers were nobles, without the need for the king's appointment each time. Thus, the sources of power were different, and naturally, the degree of compliance was different. To put it more vividly, under the feudal system, the nobles were the shareholders of power, While under the centralized system, the bureaucrats were the managers of power. Clearly, the centralization of the political structure signifies the enhancement of state capacity. To comprehend this significant transformation in Europe is not difficult. Consider who we usually think of when we mention the most powerful, or at least the most well-known kings in Europe. We often recall figures like Louis XIV of France, Elizabeth I of England, Philip II of Spain, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Peter the Great of Russia.
Right. What do these individuals have in common? They all emerged between the 16th and 19th centuries.
Can we recall any European kings before the 16th century? Our impressions are rather vague, aren't they? We might dimly remember John the Lackland king, who was beaten by the nobility and forced to sign the Magna Carta, or Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, who begged for the Pope's forgiveness in the snow. At most, we might recall the Emperor Charlemagne, but the empire he created soon fell into fragmentation. Anyway, in short, before the 16th century, we can hardly think of any particularly dominant European kings, forming a stark contrast to the stellar array of kings between the 16th and 19th century. Why is there such a contrast in our historical memory? Simply put, under the feudal system, kings were not as significant, and only within a centralized system did they become the towering imperial figures we know today. Faced with this transformation, Tilly's question, or rather, the perplexity of many scholars, is why? Why did the feudal system, which lasted for over 1,000 years in Europe, collapse? And why did the new centralized system win out in institutional competition? Tilly's answer is war. You might say, hasn't wars always existed? Why did war lead to the construction of centralized states after the 16th century? Although war has always existed for Europe, the intensity and frequency of warfare increased significantly after the 16th century. Before that, Europe also had wars over royal succession and territorial disputes. But after the 16th century, the Reformation brought about large-scale religious wars, and the Age of Discovery sparked colonial rivalry. The most famous of these wars, of course, is the 30 Years' War, a religious conflict that swept across Europe, directly or indirectly, causing 8 million deaths. At the time, this was a terrifying number. Moreover, advancements in military technology exacerbated the brutality of war. Whereas a bow and arrow could once kill a single person, a cannon could now kill dozens with a single blast. So the increasing density and intensity of war, how is this related to state construction? When warfare was relatively mild, the feudal political structure could still support the conduct of war. But as war intensified, only a centralized transformation of the state could win. How were wars fought under the feudal system? Kings summoned nobles, nobles summoned knights, and knights took peasants. These essentially militia organizations would set off with their own provisions and cookware, and in the middle of a battle, they might have to rush back home to harvest crops before returning to the fight. This was when the king was lucky, order series, he was unlucky. Nobles would refuse to march or fund the war, or even turn around and strike the king a heavy blow. As you know, this is the origin of the English Magna Carta. Therefore, the feudal system was not an efficient war system. War as a mechanism for state creation. The establishment of standing army. This war forced political transformation. First and foremost, war drove the establishment of standing armies. Today, we might take for granted that a country has an army, especially for us Chinese. It's hard to fathom a country without an army. Not to mention the army of the living. We even have an army for the dead, the famous terracotta army, which is such an army accompanying the dead in burial. However, historically, this was not the case in many countries. In the Western feudal system, the military did not belong to the state, but essentially to the nobility, merely lent to the state from time to time. Kings always short of money. could not afford to maintain a large-scale professional army. It wasn't until the founding of the United States during the Constitutional Convention that one of the most fiercely debated topics was whether to establish a standing army. To many Americans at the time, why establish a standing army? It's understandable to assemble an army during wartime, but why maintain an army during peacetime? Was it to suppress the people? Thus, in their previous political tradition, a national army was a very dubious institution. But as warfare intensified, this skepticism became increasingly extravagant because makeshift armies became less and less effective. At first, the institutional innovation of various countries was not to establish a standing army, but to heavily rely on mercenaries, essentially using market mechanisms to solve the problem of troop recruitment. For example, the famous Swiss Pike Corps were true international warriors who fought for anyone who paid, fighting for France against Prussia one day and for Prussia against France the next. However, gradually, kings found that mercenaries were also insufficient because as warfare expanded to a certain scale, it was no longer a matter of hundreds or thousands of soldiers, but tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of soldiers. At this point, relying on mercenaries to fight wars became increasingly unrealistic. Why? Because the cost was too high to bear. Moreover, mercenaries being available to all lacked political loyalty, which also affected their combat effectiveness. Think about it. If a soldier feels he is fighting to protect his homeland, he may be willing to fight to the death without retreating. But if all he can think about during battle is whether the opposing country might offer a higher price, he would easily become distracted. Right? So, by the end of the 18th century, mercenaries were gradually phased out. In their place emerged more stable, larger, and more loyal standing armies. Tilly's book contains statistics showing that in 1500, France had only 18,000 armed soldiers, but by 1850, this number had grown to 430,000 hold. During the same period, Britain went from 25,000 to 200,000 soldiers. Russia's troops increased from 35,000 in 1600 to 850,000. The advent of standing armies can be considered the most critical step in centralization. Previously, the power of kings and nobles was largely symmetrical fan-shan leftward. This symmetry ceased to exist. War as a mechanism for state creation, the establishment of central financial mechanism. The second mechanism by which war enhances state capacity is the promotion of the modern fiscal state. Under the feudal system, common people certainly had to pay various taxes and duties. But generally, they were not paid to the king or the government, but to the lords and the church. Of course, nobles also had to pay taxes to the king, but the tax base of the nobility and that of the entire population were not comparable in coverage. More importantly, the negotiating power of the nobility was entirely different from that of the common people. Nobles had weapons, knights, and militia, while the state did not have a standing army. Moreover, the number of nobles was relatively small, so their organizational costs were low. And the difficulty of them uniting to oppose the king was far lower than that of the peasants organizing to oppose the king. So was it easy for kings to collect taxes from the nobility under the feudal system? Certainly not. It basically depended on the nobles' mood. Feeling generous, they would pay more series. Feeling otherwise, they would not pay at all. If the king disagreed, he was often beaten. Looking at the early history of the British royal family, it is almost a bloody history of the king being beaten by the nobility and the church. During the Middle Ages, the British royal family often traveled around the country to adjudicate cases and collect fees, which was also a way to generate income. However, after the 16th century, with the intensification of warfare, this begging financial model became increasingly unsustainable. This is not hard to understand, Hundi. It was the early transition to mercenaries or later standing armies. How could they be supported without money? For example, Prussia's standing army, which had only 2,000 people in 1640, had increased to 200,000 by 1786. Without an expanded and stable financial source, how could such a massive army be maintained? There was also the issue of equipment upgrades. Ancient warfare often involved close combat, so nobles could charge into battle with a few horses, a suit of armor, and swords and gun. Modern warfare required the use of cannons, various firearms and ammunition, and even warships, which often could only be supplied by national strength, like the Spanish Armada, which was the result of the then Spanish King Philip II's desperate financial effort. In addition, there was military training in the past. Warfare mainly relied on the temporary conscription by the nobility, being a soldier when going out and a farmer when returning home. Now, as warfare became more intense, it was necessary to spend several years training professional soldiers to win, such as the Spanish square array and the Swedish linear formation, which required strict training to be effective and long-term. Large-scale military training also required funding. Therefore, war forced all warring countries to establish an expanded and stable financial system. Full-time tax departments were gradually established, replacing the tax farming system that appealed to intermediaries. Minimize the tax system, which mainly targeted the landed nobility, was gradually expanded to touch the entire population access bay. Annual taxes gradually replaced special taxes that were decided on a case-by-case basis. Because taxes were always insufficient, various countries also used all means to solve the problem of war expenses. For example, Britain relieved the problem of war expenses through financial innovations under government credit. The French royal family relieved financial pressure by selling a large number of official positions, and it is said that before the French Revolution, more than 70,000 official positions had been sold, with hundreds of royal secretaries. Spain became the hegemon of early modern Europe by relying on American silver. Russia solved the financial problem by intensifying the exploitation of serfs. So anyway, in short, in this process, the countries that could find the most sustainable solutions to national financial problems became the ultimate winners of the war. War as a mechanism for state creation, the establishment and expansion of the bureaucratic administration system. The third aspect of war-creating states is the establishment and expansion of the bureaucratic administrative system. Under the feudal system, a hierarchical bureaucratic government either did not exist or was very small, because at that time, even if there were public services, they were mainly provided by lords or the church, and the central government had neither the desire nor the ability to support a full-time civil servant team. And even if there were occasional wars, the soldiers would be disbanded after the war and the money would be spent. And then it would be dealt with the next war. So there was no need to establish a long-term bureaucratic organization for support. We often see a statement that the ancient Chinese were amazing, and they invented the imperial examination system 1,000 years ago, which solved the problem of providing excellent talents for the government. Why couldn't the ancient Westerners think of this? In fact, the ancient Westerners couldn't think of this mainly because their political structure didn't need it. There was no large-scale, multi-level bureaucratic government. And of course, there was no need to think about how to select officials. Why is the British government called a cabinet? Because it was very small at the beginning, so small that an attic-sized space could accommodate it. So how to appoint officials is not a systematic problem, and the small-scale employment needs can be met by pulling from clergy, nobility, or judges. However, the intensification of warfare changed this. War not only requires soldiers, taxes, weapons, food intelligence, transportation, etc., but also requires a bureaucratic organization to organize and coordinate all of these. The more intense and dense the warfare, the more it is necessary to establish an efficient bureaucratic organization. As a result, there are government departments such as population statistics agencies, land registration agencies, tax departments, intelligence departments, food management departments, equipment procurement departments, infrastructure departments. So adding up all these functional departments constitutes a bureaucratic government. Around 1600, the British central government had only 1,400 to 2,000 people. But by 1797, the British central government had more than 16,000 employees. And compared with various countries in Western Europe, it was already a very small government. Therefore, the intense warfare that began in the 16th century gave birth to the construction of standing armies, financial nations, and bureaucratic systems in various European countries. This is the mechanism of war creating states. Those countries that timely and successfully transformed their political systems from feudal structures to centralized structures were able to survive the battles of hundreds of years. And on the contrary, they might be eliminated by history. As Tilly found, there were about 500 political units in Europe in 1500, and by 1900, there were only more than 20. This change in quantity precisely illustrates this cruel process of survival of the fittest. Today, we all know Germany, France, the United Kingdom, but how many of us understand the Duchy of Saxony, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Duchy of Burgundy, the Kingdom of Bavaria, and more obscure political entities that have disappeared in the long river of history? State construction is such a jungle game of big fish eat small fish eat shrimp. Why is China's state construction so precocious? Obviously, this theory of war creating states not only helps us understand Europe, but also helps us understand other countries. For example, some scholars have pointed out that the reason why the state capacity of African countries is generally weak to a large extent is because Africa is sparsely populated, coupled with a nomadic economy. So there have been no dense, large-scale wars in history, and its state construction also lacks motivation. At the other end of the state construction continuum is China. Just now I talked about how the intensification of war forced the state construction of Europe. And I think you may feel familiar with this story. I think you may all associate it with the spring and autumn and warring states, periods of China. It can be said that China has experienced a historical process very similar to that of Western Europe, only this process occurred about 2,000 years earlier in China, and the frequency and intensity of warfare were much higher. Many scholars have pointed out that in terms of breaking away from the feudal system and building a centralized state, China is the earliest modern state. This precocious modernity is precisely because China experienced the intensification of warfare earlier. Let's think about it. Why is the Warring States period called the Warring States period, isn't it? Because there were wars all the time. In fact, during the spring and autumn period, warfare was still relatively civilized. We know that the Western Zhou dynasty emphasized the ritual system, and even warfare had to follow etiquette and law. So during the Eastern Zhou spring and autumn period, there was still this ancient legacy. The so-called having a reason for going to war and not killing the envoy and not attacking without drums the enemy, did not line up and did not fight, were all manifestations of the Zaku rituals. However, as warfare became more and more intense, warfare did not care about eating manner. In the late Warring States period, we Chinese have a certain understanding of the brutality of warfare. The famous Battle of Changping, where the Yuan army buried 400,000 soldiers of the state of Zafado alive. It is said that even in the 20th century, skeletons from the Battle of Changping were occasionally unearthed, which is extremely brutal. I saw an estimate in Fukuyama's The Origins of Political Order that the number of soldiers mobilized by the QNN state accounted for 8 to 20% of the total population, which is very amazing. Even the ancient Rome, known for its bravery in war, only mobilized about 1% of the total population as soldiers. and the glory of the Roman Empire in terms of unification and centralization has never been successfully replicated in Europe. So it is not surprising that China's state construction is much earlier and stronger than Europe. In the hundreds of years of brutal warfare during the spring and autumn and warring states periods, why did the QNN state win and unify the world in the end? Of course it is because the state construction of the QNN state went the farthest. At that time, many countries were carrying out legalist reforms, such as the reforms of Li Kui in the state of Wei and Wu Qi in the state of Chu. But when it comes to a narrow road, the ruthless win. We all know the famous Shangyang's reform. Shangyang is really too ruthless. Looking at the content of Shangyang's reform, you will find that it is a textbook-like state construction project. First, break the hereditary system of noble ranks, which is the core element of destroying the feudal system. The royal family without military merits cannot be registered. Without military merits, your noble rank is in danger. In this way, the hats on the princes' heads are no longer their private property, but have been nationalized and become bait for the state to tame society. Second, abolish the well-field system and open up the boundaries, which economically strikes at the feudal nobles and frees the people from their dependence on the nobles' land, switching to the orbit centered on the state. The satellite no longer revolves around the planet, but directly revolves around the star. Third, according to military merits, he who can get one enemy's head will be rewarded with a noble rank. Kill an enemy and be ennobled, which stimulates the combat effectiveness of the army. Fourth, register households and implement the joint liability system so that those who run away have nowhere to hide and those who migrate have nowhere to stick. In this way, not only is the entire society placed under the control of the state, but also one of the state's eyes becomes thousands of eyes for mutual supervision in society. In short, Shangyang's reform is to break the princes and establish the center area, deconstruct society, and strengthen the government. In the words of the scholar Qin Hudi, it is to break the countless small communities in society and integrate them into the large community of one heart and one mind. Therefore, some people say that the Shangyang's reform is the liberation of the common people, and I'm very skeptical about this. This is clearly the victory of the emperor, not the liberation of the common people. Not to mention that some scholars have researched that the so-called military ennoblement after Shangyang's reform has a ceiling for the common people, and the ennoblement of the nobility still widely exists. Also, the property of the ennobled nobility can be taken away by the emperor at any time. Even if the common people get rid of the oppression of the nobility, they are just transferred from the hands of the nobility to the hands of the emperor. What is the liberation? Moreover, there are many nobles. So in theory, if the oppression is too heavy, the common people can escape from one noble to another. But there's only one emperor. Where can you run? It is really those who run away have nowhere to hide, and those who migrate have nowhere to stick. Chairman Mao said that China has followed the QNN system for 100 generations, and the tradition of China's state capacity originates from this. Some people might ask, why is it that China is a war creates states and Europe is also a war creates states? But China's tradition of state capacity is much deeper than that of Western Europe. Or to use a more intuitive standard, why did Europe start with hundreds of political entities fighting, big fish eating small fish eating shrimp, but after fighting to dozens of political entities, it stopped instead of unifying like China? There are, of course, many reasons for this, such as differences in terrain and landforms, different degrees of war intensity, and different strengths of legalist reforms, etc. But in the final analysis, it is the basic principle of understanding politics we mentioned before politics are in society. In simple terms, when the West began its state construction around the 16th century, their central power was deeply embedded in a network of mutually restraining powers. In addition to royal power, there were powerful religious power, highly autonomous cities, rising commercial classes, and even more powerful noble power. All these other forces acted like reins constraining the speed of the state construction horse. When China began this process 2,000 years ago, there were not so many UN political powers and there were not very complex social and economic structures. So the state construction was like a horse running away, all the way to unification. Therefore, where does state capacity come from? Unfortunately, war is an important mechanism. In China, the hundreds of years of warfare during the spring and autumn and warring states periods, although cruel, laid the foundation for a highly centralized, unified political structure. In Europe, on the one hand, war brought the driving force for state construction peace. On the other hand, a pluralistic political structure has constrained the depth of state construction. In Africa, Latin America, India, and other countries, there were relatively few wars in history, and the unexpected consequence was the lack of motivation for state construction, so that today's governments find it difficult to monopolize violence. Therefore, a tragic historical observation is that state construction is like buying a house, and cruel, violent conflicts are like payments. You can choose a large down payment, a large tail payment, or a long installment payment. But you cannot escape payment. Of course, history is history. Living in an era where resources are becoming more and more abundant and civilization is becoming more and more progressive, we still hope that for reaching political order, humanity can find smarter ways than killing each other.